Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue our close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Today we are going to go through the second section of the first chapter of the book, the concept of enlightenment. Last time we went through the first section, and we talked about enlightenment's relationship with myth. We talked about magic. We talked about mana, and we talked about what enlightenment was doing to language. And in the second section, we are going to go through those ideas again, but into more details. And we talked about, if you remember, the magical stage of history and how it was marked by a state of transformation and representation. And as we move towards the mythical stage, representation began to wither away. But it's important to keep in mind that this transition wasn't rapid or sharp, and that elements of magic were carried through the mythical phase. And so this is the second section of the concept of enlightenment opens with precisely this idea that priests, those who supervise rituals to make sure that myths are being reenacted in those rituals, those who supervise the realization of myths. So the priests are still using elements of the magical phase, and the main element of magic, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, that priests were using, it's symbols. They say the teachings of the priests were symbolic in the sense that in them sign and image coincided. As the hieroglyphs attest, the word originally also had a pictorial function. This function was transferred to myths. They, like magic rites, refer to the repetitive cycle of nature. So what this means is that a symbol is when a sign resembles the image that it refers to. When I see a tree, for example, and then I want to communicate something about the tree to someone else, but there is no tree around, what do? I use words. So I say, I came across a tree, and with the word tree, that's the sign, you have an image in your head of an actual tree. So you know that the sign tree refers to the image of a tree, but the word tree doesn't resemble the image of the tree at all, right? There is no link between them besides a conventional link, like we decided arbitrarily that the word tree would coincide with the image of the tree. But outside that arbitrary convention, they don't coincide, right? There is no correspondence between the two. However, in magic, they are supposed to have that link. Whatever the sign is that refers, to an image in magic, they have to coincide so that the magic would actually happen. Like we mentioned with the example of the voodoo doll last time. If the voodoo doll, if the doll, which is the sign, is arbitrarily assigned to the actual person, then the spell will not work. So this is why Adorno and Horkheimer mention hieroglyphs. In hieroglyphs, the sign is an actual picture of the thing that it refers to, and so this seems to confer an actual power to the sign, a power that the sign is the actual thing that it is symbolizing, and hence it is a representative. And like we mentioned with the example of sacrifice, if the lamb doesn't actually represent the god offered as a sacrifice, but is just a random lamb, like it was selected randomly, and that even the fact that it was a lamb offered as a sacrifice was also random, like why didn't we pick a rabbit, for example? So if these selections were random, the magic will not operate. The offering must be symbolic for the god, a representative, and therefore it must coincide with it. And so this is what a pictorial function means. Like the sign must act like a picture, like a representative of the thing that it is referring to. And this function is also present in myths, because myths too are about this repetitive cycle of nature, like nature repeats itself through the symbols. So the image reenacts the tree, and the word tree reenacts the image of the tree, etc., etc., etc. So as they say, nature as self-repetition is the core of the symbolic, an entity or a process which is conceived as eternal because it is reenacted again and again in the guise of the symbol. So symbols refer, symbols would therefore guarantee the inexhaustibility of what they signify. Like nature takes on this always renewed aspect because it is never exhausted, and therefore every single thing in nature, or the world itself, benefits from this aspect. Every single thing is never exhausted. We refer to this as mana. We talked about this last time, where the boundaries between the categories of classification get blurry, and therefore nothing really stays in its place, but is always connected to other things, so that everything can mimic everything else. And so this is contrasted with Genesis, for example, in which God marks himself as separated from his creation. God in the Abrahamic religions is not a symbol, and its creation doesn't represent or symbolize God. That would be idolatry, which is forbidden by the Abrahamic religions. But in other myths, everything comes from the same power, but in an immanent way. Like there is no separation between the creator and creation. Myths about, for example, primordial beings from which the rest emerges, like the primordial egg of the world, or the primordial cow, or the primordial mother. All of those things are symbolic, and therefore even in societies where anthropomorphism, for example, is condemned, the symbolic nature of their religion can still survive. It kind of leaves the core untouched. And so you can have a multiplicity of deities in symbolic religions, whereas the Abrahamic religion don't really allow for polytheism. And Abrahamic religions are monotheist, meaning that only one thing can be considered God, and the divine cannot be represented by anything that is not that God. And so in polytheism, Adorno and Horkheimer write, the essence of the gods is not exhausted by individuality. They still had about them a quality of mana. They embodied nature as a universal power. But the presence of mana, the presence of mana, it is transferred to myth, but there was some sort of secularization already. When we moved from magic to myth, myth is just another way of not really coping with mana, but another way of suppressing it. Like, okay, we take elements of it, but we kind of suppress mana, and we found the same thing later on with science. Like monotheism, they don't really discuss monotheism, but it's I think it is implied here. The point is that monotheism isn't really against the principle of mana, if it is understood as things intermingle for the sake of repetition. But monotheism is more like, monotheism would be saying something like this, like, I don't like how we've been doing this mana thingy, and so I want a more accurate way to do this repetition. Like monotheism is not really against repetition, but it doesn't like how we've been understanding repetition all this time. And so science does the same thing, by the way. Science is about the same repetition, but in scientific terms, if you want. The self repetition of nature is also present in nature, in science, sorry, but science wants to do it in a different way. Like in regular myth, the mingling of the elements together is recognized, but myth is like, we've been understanding it in the wrong way compared to people who believe in magic. The right way is by putting some distance between the things of nature, like seas, forests, winds, mountains, etc., and the universal power that moves them. Like myth and monotheism and science, they all recognize this universal power, but they just want to say that it has to be separate and not really embodied in nature. We already have this in myth. Like we kind of have this beginning of a separation between the sign and the thing that it between the sign and the signified. So in the Greek myths, for example, the authors argue that the Olympian chronique scandaleuse, which means that the whole sex adventures of Zeus, like these are actually about the mingling and intermingling of elements of nature, of colliding elements of nature, but they are told in a more rational way, meaning a more allegorical way, right? Like rational and allegorical, they kind of go together, because with allegories we make a distance between the image in the allegory and the things that we are really talking about. So it's about separating the sign from the image, and the image from the thing, or keeping in mind that at least they are different things. So we have to keep in mind that the thing is real, like the tree is real, but the sign tree is a fantasy, and we shouldn't confuse the two. And that is the premise of nominalism, if you remember, which we discussed last time. So science is just doing to myth what myth was actually doing to magic, meaning that for science, myth confuses fantasy with the real, and myth been saying the same thing about magic. Like in magic, you confuse the fantasy with the real. And so science would be the most advanced or developed stage of this separation, since it is so pervasive into all spheres of life, including language itself. Like first, the scientific organization of the world, and then the social world, came with a division of labor. Like each person or group is assigned a certain function within the process of production, and these functions must be delineated very sharply, so not to cause confusion between the functions. And second, the division of labor also goes to language itself. It separates language it divides it between different functions. Like for example, poetic language is giving its own sphere, and it cannot mingle with scientific or neutral language. And so Enlightenment argues that when people use poetic language to denote reality or to name reality, they will run the risk of confusing science with object, because poetry is it still has that element of magic where sign and the object and the signified are basically one and the same. They are linked. And so that's how you would make people animists. And we talked about animism, and we said that was the main enemy of Enlightenment. So poetic language must be suppressed or giving a secondary position, like it must have a lesser impact than scientific language, which is deemed to be the language of neutrality and of objectivity. So with scientific language, there is no risk of projection, and poets, on the other hand, have this tendency of always projecting their emotions on the world. And so we need to keep in mind that the language that counts is that of the scientist, not of the poet. So poetry itself, even when used, must be used within the scientific paradigm, as in we have to actively know that the signs used in poetry are separate from reality. And so poetry is therefore allowed to exist, but simply as an aesthetic activity, something to simply enjoy, but we cannot make any claims about reality using poetic language. That would be the function of science now. So more broadly, it is art in itself that is confined to a lower reference. Science becomes the absolute reference of language, and so when we want to understand anything about the world, science is the primary reference to that. So art becomes secondary or lower, and therefore it matters less as reference, and must therefore obey the standards of the higher reference. And so art itself becomes compartmentalized. We start classifying the arts as well, like the visual, the sound, the literary, etc. Each one has its own, strict rules that only, sharpen the distinction with the other arts. So much so that even art loses its unifying aspect. So the authors mention two important things here. They write about art. Its unity can never be restored by the addition of these arts, by synesthesia or total art. So what they say is like when you add the different arts together, you don't get a unity of art because, well, each art must be kept separate from others, at least conceptually. Like the two important things are synesthesia and total art. Now the first has two meanings, one about a neurological phenomenon, and the other in relation to art. Although I don't think that Adorno and Horkheimer use it in the first sense. Like the neurological sense is when, you know, something happens in the brain and you get to experience two senses simultaneously through just one sense. It often describes when someone sees colors when they hear music or sounds. It's called synesthesia because it's like a synthesis between different aesthetic experiences. And so the scientific division of labor in language and in the art makes this impossible. Even from a neuroscientific point of view, it is associated with a disorder of the brain, like it is an illusion due to a malfunctioning. So normally the two experiences, sight and sound, should be separate. They cannot make a singular experience in reality. So in reality there is just sight and sound, and we can make a combination of the two only as long as we remember that the combination is a product of our mind and that it doesn't exist in reality. So the first meaning of the word can be relevant here. As for the second meaning, which is probably the one you know the authors think about here, it's that when you have artists who combine different art mediums in order to create something akin to synesthesia, not really sure, but you know, they can create something akin to it in the neurological sense. It's when artists try to paint movement, for example, like not something moving but the movement itself, or when they try, you know, literally to make you see a melody through the use of colors. What is implied is that there is no sharp distinction between the modes of expression and experience. Then, you know, there is the second thing, which is the total art, which refers to the concept of the complete work of art, or, you know, the total work of art by Richard Wagner, the 19th century German composer. So in German, I think it's the Gesamtkunstwerk in German. It means a form of art in which, you know, all the forms are included and they tend towards a unity of art itself. And so Wagner saw the opera as the best medium for this, since it can unite all the other forms, like it unites singing, poetry, dancing, music, and acting, etc. But this would be impossible in the scientific worldview, where precisely the forms of art cannot form a unity, unless, you know, that unity is acknowledged as an illusion. So the unity that we would experience may resemble, you know, the dramatic act of the opera we're watching, but that's just it. You know, it's just a resemblance in the sense that what we experience as unity is just, you know, an illusion. You know, it looks like it, but it's not really it. So it is just a sign, and a sign that is not even that good for its real scientific job. The job of a sign should be calculation. It should only serve the purpose of exploiting whatever it is signifying. Like anything else that a sign would do besides exploiting is useless, you know, precisely. It has no business being a sign if it's not going to help us exploit, you know, the signified. At best, you know, it's just an image for an aesthetic experience, and that's it, nothing more. As they say, as sign, language must resign itself to being calculation, and to know nature must renounce the claim to resemble it. As image, it must resign itself to being a likeness, and to be entirely nature must renounce the claim to know it. So in short, if you are a sign, you know nature, by which we mean you can exploit it, but you cannot resemble it. If you want to be an image, okay, you can resemble nature then, but you are denied the knowledge of nature. And so we either know nature or we resemble it, but we cannot do both. And if we know, we exploit. If we resemble, then we don't know anything. So either sign or image means a choice between knowledge or resemblance. But this is precisely where enlightenment begins to destroy itself. The point of science so far has been to claim that it knows nature, right? So we can simply say that science is knowledge, but at the same time it maintains that knowledge through a separation between that knowledge and the thing that it knows, that is nature. So knowledge must be separate from nature. You know, knowledge is basically a system of signs here. So the signs that make that knowledge are different from the things that they refer to. So if that's the case, then knowledge boils down to an aesthetic experience as well. Like since science has blamed art for being just that, an experience, an aesthetic experience, like for science, art's error is that it is an aesthetic experience which is separate from the world, but it claims to coincide with the world. Science, on the other hand, claims that it is also an aesthetic experience, but one that is aware that it is an illusion. You know, it is aware of its nature as an illusion. And this awareness that it is, you know, just a bunch of signs seems to confer to the authority that it seems to confer to it the authority that it claims. It seems to legitimize its authority. And as such, both art and science, they actually converge, with science, you know, being aware of its of itself as an aesthetic experience. It takes, you know, the lead and claims authority over art. You know, we converge. We are both illusions, but the difference is that I know that I am an illusion, and because I know that I am an illusion, I have primacy over you. And so science becomes the manager of art now, because it is like art but superior to it because it is aware of what it is. But also science becomes vulnerable too, since it is now also a manageable part of culture. Like when it admits itself to be just science admits that it is just another aesthetic experience. It is another aestheticism, and therefore has no intention of transcending the system in which it exists in, right? Like its awareness of itself as aesthetic experience is what gives it its neutrality and objectivity, which are translated as, you know, the most famous aspect of science that we still hear about today, you know, that science is apolitical. And so science is just describing the world at this point, and therefore it doesn't entangle with politics or ideology. It is like doing its own thing, you know. It becomes itself an aesthetic experience, and so it's like, hey, I'm not entering into politics or anything else, you know. I'm just doing my own thing. I am neutral. And so R2 does that, but art seems to forget this sometimes, you know, whereas science doesn't. You know, like science doesn't forget that it must not entangle with politics because it knows that it is an illusion, whereas art, because it forgets that it is an illusion, wants, you know, to go where it shouldn't go. And so scientists, they seem to think that they never bother the world, thinking that they are above it, whereas, you know, the poets are constantly engaged with the world. So as the authors write, science in its neo-positivist interpretation becomes aestheticism, a system of isolated signs devoid of any intention transcending the system. It becomes the game which mathematicians have long since proudly declared their activity to be. And so science becomes its own ivory tower. Just like, you know, any other form of art. All of them have been rendered to one thing: the active destruction of truth, which is ironically what the point of ideology that they all claim to either fight or transcend. When we saw, you know, that none of them have that intention. Like, it is precisely the point of ideology to destroy, you know, truth. And, you know, now science is actually playing its game, but ideology will come later. For now, we have to understand that this separation between science and art, this chasm is what is destroying enlightenment, or let's say the mind itself of enlightenment. Like the mind, if you want, like remember, it is looking for its happiness. We saw this in the first section, and though it will find it by banishing the wrong ideas that are, you know, standing in its way, and you know the nature of things, as Bacon told us last time. But the irony is that in trying to banish those wrong ideas, it actually made the distance even greater, which makes the mind, well, dumber. You know, it makes the distance, you know, has just, you know, been wider between, you know, the mind and the nature of things. And so scientists, from this point of view, are actually dumber than priests, poets, and magicians. So philosophers, of course, are no better. Philosophy too is marked by the attempt of closing down that chasm created between the mind and the nature of things. In philosophy, it's more a chasm between intuition and the concept. Like in philosophy, we try to make concepts intuitive, in the sense that we can, you know, grasp truth immediately. So we said before that concept means that you grasp something. Philosophy from its beginning been trying to make us do that, you know, but in an unmediated way, through intuition, because when you know something intuitively, you know that you know, right? Like if you know something by intuition, you know the kind of power that it can have, you know, when it seems so obvious. So the problem is that a lot of our intuitions are about wrong things, and philosophers want you to have intuitive knowledge about the right things, not about, you know, pseudoscience or about superstition or mere opinions, but about truth. So the issue is that those who are leading us astray from the truth are also poets. So this is how philosophers in antiquity, at least, used to look at poetry. Poets, you know, they drive us away from the truth. So the division between science and art actually started with philosophers, when philosophy was science, and before, you know, philosophy joined arts, science declared it to be also about, you know, unaware illusions. And so this is the famous battle between philosophy and poetry, which dates back to Plato. As we said about, you know, the distinction between science and art, there was an active urge to try to bridge the separation between the two. Like science doesn't banish art, but tries to work some sort of reconciliation by making art abide to the standards of science. And so the same is true between philosophy and poetry. Like Plato is famous for his radical desire to banish poets from his ideal city, because he accuses them of giving false accounts about the gods, about virtue, and about nature. But the biggest attack on poets came in the charge of their unusefulness. Or uselessness, let's say. What Plato blamed Homer for was that he never made any significant contribution or accomplishments with his poetry. Like Homer never won a war by singing about wars. He never made an invention, never reformed any troubled city, etc. So Plato argues in his book The Republic, book 10 to be more precisely, that poets are welcome to stay in the ideal city as long as they produce something useful. So poetry is acknowledged as far as insofar as we can, you know, use it for utility or for, you know, useful purposes. The only legitimacy that something can have is first and foremost through its usefulness. And so anything that is deemed useless is banished until it can, you know, demonstrate its utility. So the primary reason for why science and religion would, you know, outlaw magic is that magic is useless. Its only utility is to cause, you know, mayhem, to curse, to manipulate, to confuse, to anger God, etc. It is no surprise that, you know, magic became associated with Satanism. Like indeed, when everything is reduced to illusion, what criteria is there for its legitimacy other than utility, right? Like the only way an illusion has to gain some legitimacy is that it serves some utility first, right? So once its utility is acknowledged, then we can proceed to maybe recognize it as, you know, a transcendental truth like the forms of Plato or God in Abrahamic religion. So what the distinction between science and art, or philosophy and poetry, is really about is a distinction between the useful and the useless. The former is to be promoted, while the latter is to be discouraged. And so, as Adorno and Horkheimer write, even in its resigned detachment from existence as art, it remains dishonorable. Those who practice it become vagrants, latter-day nomads, who find no domicile among the settled. Nature is no longer to be influenced by likeness, but mastered through work. So art, like magic, is an obstacle to this mastery over nature, and therefore it needs to be discouraged. But in what way art can resist this mastery of work? Well, it is precisely its uselessness that allows art to be an obstacle for mastery over nature, because it is an obstacle to knowledge. So Adorno and Horkheimer, they insist on the resemblance between art and magic. Since art is basically a reenactment of magic, art resembles magic first in the sense that it creates its own sphere separated from the profane, and so within that sphere art has its own sacred laws. So it's like magic in the sense that when magicians or sorcerers begin a ritual, the first thing that they do is they distinguish between the sacred sites and the profane ones. Like, the former are the spheres in which, you know, the magic powers are present, or, you know, the sacred forces in which, you know, the magic happens. So magic spots sacred grounds literally by marking them out with circles, with inscriptions, artifacts, or enchanted objects. And so those sites are sealed off from the rest of reality. They are self-contained and must not be disturbed by external forces that are not sacred as well. So in other words, the rules of the outside do not apply to them. And if something tries to, they'll be, you know, committing a very terrible deed, you know. So the outside works with the laws of utility, but within the sacred sphere, utility has no place. It is, you know, profane and and it distracts from the course of the ritual. Like, this reminds me of a sketch by the comedic duo Key and Peele. They portray a group of guys who want to honor the memory of their friends who passed away, and so they are standing in a circle, and each carries a bottle of Kool-Aid, and they all proceed, you know, to pour the beverage on the ground, but then one of them refuses to do it because he considers it a waste. He'd rather drink the Kool-Aid, so they all get mad at him because this is a sacred ceremony in which, you know, you must honor the dead. And he tries to convince them that it is pointless to waste such good Kool-Aid over their dead homies. It is not going to bring them back. It's not going to bring them back, and so on. So the whole ceremony doesn't really make sense for him. But that's the point. Like, the point is that the ceremony doesn't make sense, and it doesn't have to make sense. It has its own special laws, and it doesn't have to be judged by the standards of a realm that is sealed, that it is sealed from. Kind of like when in actual offerings to gods, people bring in all kinds of food that, of course, you know, no one will eat. You know, it's just going to rot, and someone is going to be like, that it is a waste of good food, right? So magic has its own spheres in which it doesn't depend on outside standards or outside forces. Like, beyond the sacred grounds, you can exploit nature, but in some sites, the utility principle has to beat it. And so a tree on profane grounds, on profane grounds, can be a table, can be a chair, or it can be a house, but on sacred grounds, it is the home of some spirits that you don't want to mess with. So by messing with the spirits, what is meant is that you think you can exploit them. And so this is when In movies, you have people who want to go into sacred magical sites because they want to extract something valuable from there, often for money or for science. And you have locals who tell them not to go in there because they will be trifling with powers beyond their understanding. And you know, it's like, oh, you think you it's like, you know, these people will be like, oh, you think there is no curse, you think you can understand that, you know, that tree that is home to spirits. Well, you're about to discover the limits of your knowledge, my friend. So yes, the point of the tree being a sacred tree is that it cannot be grasped by instrumental knowledge. It is something from the outside, which means that it cannot affect it. You know, you'll be more affected by it than it is by you. And so this is the idea behind many horror movies, in which, you know, someone warns a group of people not to go to some place because it is haunted, or because, you know, it is sacred, or something like that. And so such places obliterate scientific knowledge because we cannot use scientific knowledge there. We cannot make the tree fit into any category anymore. And so the presence of a special sacred force makes the tree not a tree, and the science men won't know how to classify it, you know, where to classify the tree. And so that impotence of knowledge in front of the sacred tree is an instant of mana. You know, the tree becomes a symbol of something more than itself. And so the particular here relates directly to the absolute, that experience of the sacred. As you approach a tree within a sacred ground, it is called an aura. So a tree has an aura in the sense that it relates to something more than itself. And so art, according to the authors, works just like that. Art too, you know, is closed off from the outside world. A painting is its own sacred site. It cannot be apprehended through scientific knowledge, just like, you know, the sacred tree cannot be apprehended by scientific knowledge. And so in the presence of art, the painting, or, you know, the piece of music, it binds you into the aesthetic experience like the tree binds you into the experience of the sacred. And so you are experiencing, you know, something, you know, that is beyond what you are just, you know, seeing like right there. You are, you know, experiencing something more than just colors or sounds, like you experience more than just the tree. And so through the painting, which is an image, very important to keep that in mind, you experience the actual things that the painting literally represents. Like, you know, the tree represents the higher powers dwelling within it. It represents, you know, the power of the spirits, and thus it repeats it, it duplicates it. And so this is why the authors write about, you know, renunciation to being affected by the outside, that this renunciation places the pure image in opposition to corporeal existence, the elements of which the image sublates within itself. It is in the nature of the work of art, of aesthetic illusion, to be what was experienced as a new and terrible event in the magic of primitives, the appearance of the world, of the whole, in the particular. So the work of art constantly reenacts the duplication by which the thing appears as something spiritual, a manifestation of mana. That constitutes its aura. As an expression of totality, art claims the dignity of the absolute. So Enlightenment is kinda right when it says that art is an obstacle to knowledge. That's because it's supposed to be, right? But Enlightenment sees this as something bad. And so we have to force our way through the sacred. That's why Enlightenment is about, you know, the disenchantment of the world. We have to get ourselves rid of anything that is sacred. All sacred sites must be seen as regular sites. Like, there is nothing special about the grounds with, you know, with the magic circles and all of that. It's just, you know, like any other ground. So the fact that art limits knowledge is seen as bad by Enlightenment, but for a few philosophers who are not fans of Enlightenment, that art limits knowledge is actually a good thing and is something to be celebrated and embraced. And so this limit was actually seen as proof of the superiority of art over science. So Adorno and Horkheimer mentioned the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Schelling, and so for him, the point of art is to be, the prime guide of human beings when their knowledge reaches dead ends. It is, obvious that we cannot know everything, not because we don't have the time for it, but because some things are indeed unknowable, or more precisely, some things are unknowable by the standard of scientific knowledge, meaning a knowledge founded upon the separation of sign and image. But there are things, however, that exist in their own right, but can only be experienced and known through representation, meaning when sign and image coincide. And so, if science enters that domain, it will just cause mayhem, and therefore science must trust those who have the kind of knowledge that is appropriate to deal with those things. And so those referred to here are artists, and more precisely, poets. Quote, according to Schelling, art begins where knowledge leaves humans in the lurch. For him, art is the model of science, and wherever art is, there science must go. According to this theory, the separation of image and sign is entirely abolished by each single representation of art. So, art had a genuine role to play in contemporary society that are, societies that are becoming more and more science-driven and pragmatic. But as the authors also point, we are talking about bourgeois society here. The mindset of the bourgeoisie doesn't make much room for art. Instead, when the bourgeois mind reaches the limits of scientific knowledge, when it gets to the limits of the knowable world and is on the threshold of the things that lie beyond primary experience, beyond what we can see, smell, touch, or calculate, at that threshold, bourgeois society prefers turning to faith rather than art. So, it was always through faith that people tried to reconcile, existence and the spiritual world, that great beyond when we arrive at the limits of perception. So the religious leaders mentioned in the book, like Mohammed, like Luther, or the Dominican friar Thomas de Torquemada, when they wanted to reform their society, they resorted to faith in order to maintain a connection between spirituality and material experience. But the problem with faith, besides the fact that it is faith, is that it is actually dependent on knowledge, the same kind of knowledge that we are criticizing here. It is dependent in the sense that its identity as faith relies on its relationship with this knowledge, as they write, but faith is a privative concept. It is abolished as faith if it does not continuously assert either its opposition to knowledge or its agreement with it. So nowadays we tend to identify faith as the opposition to knowledge. When you don't know, anymore, you appeal to faith. Whereas in the Middle Ages, it was faith because knowledge and it coincide. So we still have some of that today when someone tells you that science proved something in the Quran or something like that. Like I know it's faith when I find agreements with it in science, or I know that it's faith when I don't find any agreements with it in science. Like if science disagrees with it, it is faith, and if it agrees with it, it is faith. So faith has only, its identity in relationship to scientific knowledge. Art, however, doesn't have that limitation. It doesn't rely, it doesn't really care, actually, whether it is in opposition or agreement with science, because art is not limited by the limits that are set for knowledge. Art doesn't really need knowledge to arrive at some sort of limit or some in order to be relevant, whereas faith seems to need that. Like anything in the world can be an object of art, just like magic can enchant any object or any grounds, but with faith not anything can be holy. Like we really need scientific knowledge to reach its limits for faith to step in. And so this is, for example, illustrated in the following statement about Protestantism. They write, the attempt made by faith under Protestantism to locate the principle of truth, which transcends faith and without which faith cannot exist, directly in the word itself, as in primeval times, and to restore the symbolic power of the word, was paid for by obedience to the word, but not in its sacred form. Okay, so let's try to go through this. Now, for those who don't know, Protestantism was a theological movement that started during the Renaissance and was trying to reform the church. That is why this period in which, Protestants became a thing is called the Reformation. And so the church was predominantly Catholic, and the Protestants were like, Catholics are doing everything wrong. The reason they argued was because Catholics have it basically easy. A Catholic can commit crimes and then goes to confession, and then everything is fine. Everything is forgiven. He can do it all over again, and again go confess to a priest, and will be all good again. So what this meant for Protestants is that you only need faith to be a Christian. It doesn't really matter how big of an asshole you are, as long as you have Jesus in your heart and you go confess, then you will be welcomed in the King of God. So you don't actually have to do anything that Christianity requires from you. You don't have deeds you need to do. You just utter the utter the words, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," and you're good to go. So the reason why this bothers isn't because this seems to absolve all wrongdoers of any accountability, but because it has serious philosophical implications. And the implication is that faith is simply reduced to a speech act. The simple utterance has the actual power of turning you into a Christian. And so this was problematic for the Protestants, and so they had to make a separation between faith and works. Works here means deeds. Simply believing in Christ or uttering the words of faith is not enough for the Protestants. You also need to work hard on yourself as a Christian. And so without the role of deeds, the word was like, embedded with some sort of magical powers. Like I say, I confess, and all of my sins are washed away like by magic. So, to go back to the sentence mentioned, Protestants made the principle of truth beyond faith. It is good that you have faith, but it's not enough. You also need works. But at the same time, that truth is necessary for faith to exist. If God doesn't exist, then faith wouldn't exist. But truth is located within the Word. It's after all through the Word that God reveals truth. It is through the spoken word. So this is similar to magic, since the word itself still has the symbolic power. But because of the separation between the works and faith, the word simply becomes a power for obedience. We simply obey the word of God, but its symbolic power doesn't do its thing, and therefore it is no longer really sacred. What it means is that truth is in the word, but the word is beyond faith. Truth is beyond simple faith. For your faith to be valid, let's say, it needs to be in relation to your works, where your works, really that of a Christian. So for you, for your faith to be valid, it's going to depend on whether it is in opposition with your works or agrees with them. So to determine that, it's simple. If by obeying the word of God, you do what God said, and you do the works that are required from you, and hence your faith is valid. So as an implication of this, your faith will be some sort of hope that you are indeed doing what God told you. You may be doing works that you think are what God expects of you, but what if you are mistaken? You are in an arena, you are in an area, let's say, of unknowable here. But you cannot know what God really meant by his word, right? So Protestants say you must keep doing your work nonetheless. You simply have faith that it is that it is what God wants. You know, you'll know that during the day. You'll know that during the day of judgment. And so Protestants also believe in predestination. So for them, God already decided who gets to go to hell and who gets to go to heaven, and it will be revealed after death. So we just do our works and have faith in his judgment. And so your deeds can either be the friend or the foe to your faith. They can save your faith if it's in agreement with it, or they can condemn you forever if it is in opposition. So there is no way of knowing this, and so that's why we rely on faith. So no scientific knowledge can allow you to know how you are really doing. And so since now the validity of your faith can only be revealed after your death, your faith is now reduced to a state of untruth. So through this maneuver, Protestantism can be certain that people will behave, because the moment they claim that their faith is valid, then their faith will invalidate itself. And so the only way to be a believer is by not believing, actually. And so in this sense of relying solely on the belief would destroy the belief. So we need to make sure that there is nothing you can actually rely on. And so everything is stained with doubt and untruth. And so what remains is a state of bad consciousness, because honesty kind of becomes impossible. That can certainly explain, the bloody wars and conflicts over religions that followed, during the 17th century. Like faith is a ruse that would make doubt radical, because of its, because of its frenemy relationship to knowledge. Whether faith is its friend or its enemy, the point is to keep knowledge away from any pretension to truth. Okay, so faith is here to reconcile the sign with the image like art, but to maintain them as separate as possible. So the longer they are maintained apart, the longer the process of history is going to unfold. And so with doubt, there is only process. With illusion, there is only a quest for utility. And so the apologist, in this sense, must be the liar. Everything must be some other thing, but never itself. And so once something is itself, then truth has been reached. And so sign and image would coincide there. I mean, that's what truth actually means in this sense, is that the sign and the image coincide. And so enlightenment is like faith. It must keep these two separate for as long as possible, so that everything keeps jumping from being one thing to the next, but never arriving at itself. And so this is why honesty becomes impossible as long as you are alive. It is only after your death that the sign and the image are finally concealed. And so enlightenment is like faith in this sense. Like it just postpones over and over the moment where sign and image will be reconciled. So as they say, the paradox of faith degenerates finally into fraud, the myth of the 20th century, and faith's irrationality into rational organization in the hands of the utterly enlightened as they steer society toward barbarism. And so when we reach the limits of knowledge, we either go to art, which reconciles, sign and image like right now, or you go to faith, which maintains them further apart. But this, however, must not be understood as, with art and magic, there is no submission and it's all sunshine and rainbows. As a matter of fact, as early as we can trace the introduction of language in human history, its mastery was concealed to priests and sorcerers, who certainly used it for their own interests. Like the fear experienced in Mana was already instrumentalized by the leaders of clans and tribes to establish their dominance and position within hierarchies. So don't imagine that primitive people were living in some sort of, egalitarian paradise where they were, all playful all the time, right? Like I did a video on this in my close reading of Murray Bookchin's book, so you can go and check it. So we now Like, we know that power and submission were a thing and patriarchal norms existed back then, but we don't know how life was in the stage, you know, prior to the magical stage. We don't really know to what extent power was rigid and strong within the hierarchies of nomadic tribes. And so what Adorno and Horkheimer think about the structure of power in those ancient societies is that they maintained a certain relativism when it comes to power, at least to power regarding nature. The sorcerer himself might have been as vulnerable as any other member of the group in the face of the powers of nature. They write, in the nomadic savage, despite his subjection, could still participate in the magic which defined the limits of that world and could disguise himself as his quarry in order to stalk it. In later periods, the intercourse with spirits and the subjection were assigned to different classes of humanity. Power to one side, obedience to the other. So the power to one side and obedience to the other seem to have developed the more rational the societies become. The more the division of labor becomes specialized, the greater concentration of power becomes in only one side. And so specialization leads to the idea that each individual is born for a specific task. Some are born to govern, some are born to lead, while others are born to be governed and led. So rituals become a way of maintaining that distribution of power by reenacting or repeating that order. So rituals themselves become more and more specialized, as we've said earlier. And last time, their symbols become a tool for coordinating movements and work. They are meant to be some sort of social conditioning now. They condition the individual to stick to their assigned role within the division of labor. So symbols basically become fetishes. If you recall, a fetish in Marxian philosophy means when a thing loses its historical aspect and is believed to be ahistorical, as something that is natural, that doesn't have a history, but this naturalization only serves as a way to hide the historical and social process behind that thing. Like money is a fetish because the transaction makes invisible the worker's time and sweat, the process of production, the exploitation of labor, etc. It reduces labor, which is supposed to create connections and recognition between individuals, to just a mere transaction. And so here, symbols can do the same thing. Through their repetitive aspect, they can end up perpetuating an oppressive social system, which, because of its, pervasiveness, since it has been repeated everywhere and for a long time, gives the impression of being completely natural. Quote, the repetition of nature, which they signify always manifests itself in later times as the permanence of social compulsion, which the symbols represent. The dread objectified in the fixed image becomes a sign of the consolidated power of the privileged. So the reproduction of the social order becomes the point of ritual and myth. If enlightenment is just a further development of myth, or enlightenment is myth, then enlightenment too is about the reproduction of social order. And so science itself is just another fetish. It claims neutrality, and its so-called, apolitical aspect are perhaps even more effective at reproducing the social order than myth and ritual. What better than a discipline that claims to be non-ideological to perpetuate ideology, right? And so what can be more potentially repressive than something that claims that it's not repressive? And so science here is the best candidate, since it reproduces the same hierarchical models that were oppressing, individuals within tribes, but without even showing them. Science doesn't show any of its superstitions. It claims that it banished all superstitions and that it cleansed itself from nonsense. And so in that sense, science is the most advanced fetish. If, science blames all forms of knowledge that preceded it to be superstitious because it's the product of non-objective inquiry, but the society's structure and opinions and projection of their members, then it fails to see that its own structure is the product of a certain society too. So in an ancient civilization, you have a hierarchy. There is a king, there is a priest, there are priests. They like where they are, they like where they are seated. They want to maintain that order. So this civilization will produce a knowledge about the natural world that mirrors that structure. They will talk about gods who approve of their order. We have kings and priests because gods want us to have kings and priests, because that's how nature works. And so through rituals and myths, this knowledge will crystallize itself through the whole population, and they will become more obedient to it. So clearly this knowledge is influenced by the interests of the ruling class, by, a certain social order. So it is subjective. We have people who are projecting onto a natural world that is indifferent to them. They are projecting their desires and their fears and interests. So in short, this knowledge is stained with superstition. And so Enlightenment champions a knowledge that is free from superstition, but that would mean a knowledge that is divorced from the social structures in which it emerged. And so this knowledge must not be a mirror to the social order, right? But this is what Adorno and Horkheimer address. Science is as much a reproduction of the social order of its time as any myth or religion that came before it. And it's even the same order that existed before, the one based on compulsion that science is reproducing. They borrow from the sociologist Emile Durkheim here, who is known for his work on the division of labor. Quote, even the deductive form of science mirrors hierarchy and compulsion. Just as the first categories represented the organized tribe and its power over the individual, the entire social logical order with its chains of inference and dependence, the superordination and coordination of concepts is founded on the corresponding conditions in social reality, that is, on the division of labor. So as we said, the division of labor started a long time ago, way before Enlightenment. Its role was to maintain the power structure of society and to make sure that all members, through constant repetition of the same tasks, would internalize the power being exerted on them. It must come as natural to the subject that he has to obey his king. It must be natural to you. You must obey the king. Like it's almost a reflex. It's almost an instinct. No questions asked. And so science is therefore a more efficient way to do those tasks, to internalize the structure, to see the structure as natural, as ahistorical. And so the names of the dominant classes change, of course, but at the end of the day, there has to be someone who orders and there has to be someone who obeys. And so the division of labor allows the self-preservation of this order. And so the efficiency of the division of labor is its capacity of making everything dependent on everything else. Like the codependence of everyone within the process of labor maintains a certain sense of utility of the whole. By having each individual confined to a specific task, the whole can preserve itself. And so unity of the social world and power becomes indissociable. You cannot dissociate one from the other. For there to be unity, the hierarchy must be maintained. And so this gives a legitimacy for the hierarchy, since it is, operating for something that transcends it, which is, the unity of society. So this unity is like the greater good that makes sense of the world, and it makes sense of the order on which it relies. So the unity is good, therefore the hierarchy that maintains the unity must be good too. But as the authors point, and here there's a quote, this necessarily turns the whole as a whole and the operation of its immanent reason into a means of enforcing the particular interests. Power confronts the individual as the universal, as the reason which informs reality. The power of all the members of society to whom as individuals no other way is open is constantly summated through the division of labor imposed on them in the realization of the whole, whose rationality is thereby multiplied over again. So what this means is that the survival of this whole becomes a pretext for the subjugation of the individual to the collective. Here, the collectivity is the division of labor. Since we're all codependent, each individual is forced to submit to everyone else. And so hence the irrationality of the division of labor is multiplied. Each member reproduces it by being dominated by the collective. And so this domination presents itself as having no alternative. There is no other way out of it. Individuals are trapped within their own tasks, and so no other possibility of existence is offered for them. There is no alternative. This must be so. This is the only way. This is how things must. This is how things must be for the sake of the whole. And so in front of it, the individual must concede. And so power obliges the individual to confront the whole, and here represented by the universal. But this universal, this whole, is actually the enforcing of the particular interest, meaning the interest of the powerful, those who are at the top of the hierarchy. We find again the same structure that is, present in primitive societies from which Enlightenment claimed to have saved us. So everyone is repeating it. Everyone is repeating the interests of the particular, of the powerful, of the ruling class. Everyone is repeating it, and this leads to a situation in which the many suppress themselves and their own individuality. And so science gives this system its legitimacy. They say it is this unity of collectivity and power, and not the immediate social universal solidarity, which is precipitated in its intellectual forms. So the idea of the whole or the universal is not about fostering solidarity, but making the collective a tool for oppression, for the reproduction of power. And so a great example of this is in the critique of Vico, Giambattista Vico. He was an Italian counter-enlightenment philosopher of the 18th century, and he pointed out in his book called The New Science how every intellectual knowledge that claimed to be transcending the cultural boundaries of its time and place and appealing to principles of immediate solidarity was still mirroring those same cultural boundaries. So he points, for example, to how Plato and Aristotle's ideas about, universals were produced in the public place of Athena, the Agora. And although they claimed to be universal, they still represented social organizations that is pretty much, a reenactment of Athens' social hierarchies. Quote, they reflected, he's talking about the ideas about Plato and Aristotle, they reflected with the same fidelity the laws of physics, the equation of freedom, the equality of freedoms of freeborn citizens, and the inferiority of women, children, and slaves. So in other words, all claims to universality ended up reacting or recreating the conditions of domination which they claim to transcend. And so language turns into a tool for that purpose. It must be purged from the conditions of domination identified as superstition only to reinforce them. And so language starts losing any content that is suspected of superstition. Abstractions, metaphysics, all of that must be purged away from language. And so ideas, even though served the purpose of domination with Plato and Aristotle, are not efficient enough for the unity of collective and power. We need a language that conveys processes, a language that is simply pragmatic, that conveys, nothing but the division of labor and must do it efficiently. It is a language about efficiency. And so such language is the language of science. It doesn't allow the mind to think about abstractions or even to dream. That would be superstition. And superstition, imagination, daydreams, metaphysics, and all of that are all a waste of time and a waste of potential. And not only that, but metaphysical language still has the trace of a magic in it, a trace of the realm of the unknowable. And what is unknowable cannot be managed, cannot be calculated, and so it cannot be controlled, and so it cannot be considered rational, and therefore it is a threat to the social order. And so what is great with the language of science is how efficient it is as a tool for domination, because it makes everything calculable. Everything becomes predictable, manageable. Whereas with metaphysics, metaphysics still, have this, domination aspect, but at least they were some sort of obstacle, or they were, a stage towards scientific knowledge that must not drag for too long. Right? So as they write, the metaphysical apologia at least betrayed the injustice of the established order through the incongruence of concept and reality. The impartiality of scientific language deprived what was powerless of the strength to make itself heard, and merely provided the existing order with a neutral sign for itself. Such neutrality is more metaphysical than metaphysics. And so this is basically pure, unadulterated nihilism, which is the inexorable and product of the process of enlightenment. Universal concepts themselves were not enlightened enough for it. Sooner or later, they were going to be thrown out of the picture once we get a more efficient tool for domination. And so once we arrive at the fear of the collective, concepts are rendered useless. They may have slowed down the process by offering a small window into, the world of magic, but now Adorno and Horkheimer compare them to people who live on, unearned income, facing industrial trusts, right? And an industrial trust means a monopoly. It's like, a janitor at Amazon trying to face Amazon. Like all he lives through is fear, because he knows how easily replaceable he is. He can disappear in the blink of an eye. All it takes is just one decision from a chairman of the board, and he's gone forever, and he has no power over it, he has no say in it. And so the division of labor only installed a feeling of powerlessness in individuals, a powerlessness that at least could have been countered by metaphysics. But now it is just unlimited powerlessness. And so individuals constantly feel vulnerable and powerless, and so they feel nowhere to be safe. At least when nature still seemed unpredictable, people could feel some relief in the sense that their fate was more up to chance than to their superiors. The belief in fortune can confer a sense of equality among people. Like we said earlier, there isn't a side of power and a side of obedience when everything is left to chance, right? In the belief in fortune, fortune, by the way, means chance. It doesn't mean wealth; it means chance. So in that belief, the janitor can feel that he's on equal footing with the board of chairmen, but that would mean that fortune and chance claim that science cannot control them, and therefore they have to be seen as yet another superstition. Quote, if logical positivism still allowed some latitude for probability, ethnological positivism already equates probability with essence. Our vague ideas of chance and quintessence are pale relics of that far richer notion, that is, of the magical substance. So that quote is from Huber and Moss's essay about on magic. The point is, nothing is left to chance, since that would imply that there are areas that science cannot break down. So science cannot allow that, and therefore it needs to disenchant everything to make it manageable. Perhaps its biggest obstacle is the domain of the proper name. Like, having a proper name is also a mark of superstition from the point of view of science. Like my name, Ismail, is a nominalist conception. We value our proper names because it gives us a sense of worth, that we kind of stand out from the rest, that we have some sort of singularity. And so the fact that I am Ismail and you are Ahmed, Sarah, Paul, whatever, it gives some power to this body, it kind of humanizes it. Like, proper names are a sort of guarantee to be recognized as yourself, to be identical to oneself. And so science, since, as we've said, wants things to be identical to others and never to themselves, need to downplay the role of proper names. They are just a creation, a fantasy, a fantasy of the mind. In reality, there is only the matter that makes the bodies, this is the only thing that exists, and so the same matter that makes you also makes others, you know. So in order for science to make us this value the use of proper names, it needs to make us identify with others, you know, never with ourselves. And so it is no coincidence that science prefers numbers rather than proper names to do its thing. In administration, it's the numbers that replace the proper names. Prisoner number 260, worker 17, case and file 347, or I don't know what. Like the use of numbers to refer to people is a way to make an obstacle to compassion and understanding. Okay, just like it's more difficult to kill an animal after you have given it a proper name, it's more difficult to ignore someone's suffering when you know their proper name, right? It's like that anecdote attributed to Stalin, although it's certainly anachronistic. One death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. That's because when it is just one death, you can kind of know who that person was, you know, but when it is a million, you cannot distinguish between any one of them because you cannot know anyone. And so what this means is that the role of the proper name is to highlight the essence of the individual. The individual singularity is recognized by its proper name because it is supposed to reveal its essence. That is why proper names often means something, you know. There is a famous dialogue by Plato called the Cratylus. This is not mentioned in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, but it could have been. So in the Cratylus, Socrates talks with these two other guys. So there is Cratylus and there is another guy named Hermogenes. And now Hermogenes literally means the offspring of Hermes, and Socrates makes fun of Hermogenes for being kind of dumb, for not being able to interpret accordingly social cues. That's because Hermes is the god of interpretation. So being named the offspring of Hermes, you should be good at interpretation. So it used to be thought that your name should capture your essence, and your essence basically dictates what kind of behavior you must have. And so proper names here would have a performative function. You know, it is a speech act, like we've seen with confessions. By saying it, you also do it. And so, but already Plato is making the separation between the name and the thing in that dialogue. But more exactly, what Plato is doing is negating the power of the proper name by revealing it to be some sort of bullshit theory. And this is important because when you read the dialogues of Plato, when you read them carefully, the knowledge that Plato and Socrates are advancing is a negative knowledge, meaning that I get knowledge by pointing the bullshit in the common knowledge. You know, like knowledge is not to affirm something, but it is to prove others wrong. And that is why Socrates has to claim that knowledge is ignorance. You know, knowledge is the lack of knowledge. You know, that is the only true knowledge. You know that you don't know. It's like faith, and Adorno and Horkheimer use instead the notion of God in Judaism, but in a very similar way as in Plato. Like only God can have the power of speech act, only God can have the power of the word, only He can do what magicians used to do, to use words in a performative way. Hence, it becomes a sin to utter the Lord's name, to utter the Lord's name in vain, because only God can use performative language. And since proper names are performative, the name of God is the most performative of all performative utterances. And so to pronounce His name without, doing anything, literally in vain, would amount to a profanation of God's name. So anyone who do anything that resembles magic would be seen as someone trying to play God, and that is unacceptable. And so this prohibition then implies that only God is essence, only He is truth, and everything else is untruth. Whatever is asserted must be negated. Anything that depicts truth must be seen as a lie, as an illusion. Quote, "The pledge of salvation lies in the rejection of any faith which claims to depict it, knowledge in the denunciation of illusion." But this denunciation of illusion, this radical negation of everything positive or asserted is a nihilist, it is nihilism that is itself an illusion. So to claim that everything is nothingness, like in Buddhism, for example, or that everything is God, like in pantheism, is to assert the nothing as positive, and therefore it is trespassing on the prohibition of calling the absolute by its name. As such, to explain the cosmos as nothingness or as illusion is the bulk of mythologies. Like Enlightenment seems to argue that anything taken as an affirmation is an illusion, it is a myth, but so is the idea that everything affirmed is an illusion. And this idea that everything is an illusion has more resonance with old myths than the positive claims that Apollo exists or that some spirits live in some trees or stuff like that. It's even always present in magical practices. So, for example, the iconoclasm of the Enlightenment, what we call the destruction of images and idols, by which is meant illusions, is actually an image itself. As they write, the self-satisfaction of knowing in advance and the transfiguration of negativity as redemption are untrue forms of the resistance to deception. The right of the image is rescued in the faithful observance of its prohibition. But this is not a mistake or a contradiction in Enlightenment. Rather, Enlightenment needs images to survive within its process. And so here the authors, they mention Hegel, and more specifically paragraph 79 of the Phenomenology of Spirit, because they mention the term determinate negation, which is a term that Hegel uses in that paragraph and is one of the most used concepts throughout the Phenomenology. So determinate negation needs to be understood in its relationship with natural consciousness and unreal consciousness. So unreal consciousness is to be understood as stages in history. Like at one point of history, we thought that we knew what was real, and then we discover that it wasn't real. So that is unreal consciousness. But now we know what is real, and in a further stage, we learn that it was wrong too, and so the process continues, etc. Now, whenever something untrue is revealed to be untrue, like when consciousness becomes aware of its own untruth, it becomes natural consciousness. And natural consciousness is like the one that decides what to do with this new revelation. So now Hegel talks about only two possibilities, either progress or skepticism. And so both are an embrace of nothingness, but in different ways. In skepticism is like pure nothingness, a pure negation, meaning that there is no way out of this nothingness. There is nothing true at all, period. Or as Adorno and Horkheimer put it, in skepticism, both falsehood and truth are equally void. But the nothingness in progress is a bit different. It's not really pure nothingness, but determinate nothingness. It negates what was there before, but doesn't claim that there is also nothingness ahead. So for Hegel, this is a necessary process towards progress until completion, so to speak. That's the end of history in which consciousness finally reaches itself and it will become true with itself. And so there's so that's where truth exists. Throughout the process towards truth, what we do is uncover the untruth of what we thought to be true. We keep realizing that we've been wrong over and over again until there is nothing to be wrong about anymore. And so this is how progress works. You just unlearn the wrong stuff until there is nothing wrong to there is nothing wrong anymore in your knowledge. And so here, what we have isn't a complete rejection of representation of or idols, but we put them in front of the thing that they can never match. That is truth, the absolute, but not to destroy the idols, right? What this means is what we already mentioned this. Images are not negated completely, but are instead rendered inoffensive. They are integrated within truth. And so illusion are giving a legitimacy in the fact that they were necessary steps towards the completion of consciousness. Quote, dialectic discloses each image as script. It teaches us to read from its features the admission of falseness, which cancels its power and hands it over to truth. So what this means is that the system of logic in Hegel differs from positivism in the sense that it's not just a plain old collection of cold facts, but at the same time, by integrating the images into his system that puts, truth at the end of the process, the same truth succumbs to mythology. Like the dialectical system of Hegel is as totalizing as the theodicies of his time. And so many critics of Hegel have argued that his logic was actually Christianity in disguise, right? Like truth, the absolute, that was God revealing himself, at the end of time, and the process of history was just walking towards this completion, and that was, like the theodicy towards the apocalypse and the second coming of Jesus. So even truth that integrates myth is also myth. For Hegel, myth is just, one step closer to truth. That's it. Myth, when we discover that it was wrong, that error in myth was necessary to, to get closer to truth, to get closer, to the second coming of Jesus. So Christianity is about the apotheosis of mankind, and so Hegelianism is about the apotheosis of thought. So both apotheoses are about a stage in which consciousness reaches its essence. Now, apotheosis means to elevate yourself to the level of God. So essence is placed outside of history. So in religion, it is God. In philosophy, it is the absolute. And so up until there, consciousness lingers in untruth. It lingers in illusion. We are always wrong in the eyes of enlightenment, but we can be redeemed once we see that our wrong was actually a necessity towards truth, a necessity for progress. And so this means that the rejection of truth as postulated by enlightenment, is impossible. Disagreement with enlightenment is impossible, because all forms of thought are obliged to bow to enlightenment's notion of truth if they wish to survive. They must admit that they are wrong, like the Christian must admit that he is a sinner from the beginning. And so this is what makes enlightenment totalitarian. As they write, for enlightenment is totalitarian as only a system can be. Its own truth does not lie in the analytical method, the reduction to elements, the decomposition through reflection, as its romantic enemies had maintained from the first, but in its assumption that the trial is prejudiced. So, being prejudiced is the basis for oppression, because it takes away the power to speak for oneself. It predetermines the individual before their existence. And this is the point of taking away someone's proper name and give them a number instead. You predetermine them from the beginning. So it's no wonder why Enlightenment was fond of mathematics and wanted to reduce nature to mathematical equation and to numbers. As they say, when in mathematics the unknown becomes the unknown quantity in an equation, it is made into something long familiar before any value has been assigned. Nature, before and after quantum theory, is what can be registered mathematically. Even what cannot be assimilated, the insoluble and irrational, is fenced in by mathematical theorems. So the asterisk there on value is interesting, because when you compare it to the 1944 version, it says, word instead of value, like the unknown is made into something familiar before any word was given to it. And so word seems to refer to a name here. We decide of what a thing is before it becomes that thing. But word seems too neutral, whereas the notion value is different. Value implies experience and uniqueness, but giving that it's giving a a posteriori to the number and equation, it makes the value of things trivial compared to the neutrality of the number. So by downplaying the importance of the value assigned to the unknown or to anything, we make it difficult for it to be identical to itself. It must be identical to the number, like any other thing is identical to the number. So the unknown is also marked by its indeterminacy, and as such it poses a threat to enlightenment and to the totalitarian system. So it has to neutralize that indeterminacy. It must take away its power of transformation by making the only unknown a matter of quantity, instead of a matter of quality. So quantity can be managed with mathematics and numbers, even though it is not known. Even though we don't know what we are measuring, for example, as long as it has a quantity, we can manage. But when we want to focus on qualities without knowing what it is, that we are studying, for example, it becomes more problematic. Qualities are more obscure. Ever since the metaphysics of Aristotle, the notion of quality was puzzling, and it was always involved in some sort of of mysticism. There is always some sort of mysticism attached to the notion of quality. But quantity, however, is less likely to spark metaphysical debates. So it's it is from the get-go oriented towards calculation and profit, and so therefore mathematics seem safer than philosophy, and even safer than poetry, of course, to understand the world, because they are less likely to fall back into mythology. So now thought has to be equated with mathematics. We cannot run the risk of letting thought wander again with the superstition. The only thinking allowed for thought is math. And here Adorno and Horkheimer quote Edmund Husserl, who described best the project of enlightenment and its consequences on identity. They quote from him, and he says, an infinite world, in this case a world of idealities, is conceived as one in which objects are not accessible individually to our cognition in an imperfect and accidental way, but are attained by a rational, systematically unified method which finally apprehends each object in an infinite progression, fully as its own in itself. In Galileo's mathematization of nature, nature itself is idealized on the model of the new mathematics. In modern terms, it becomes a mathematical manifold. So that's the famous quote from Galileo: the language of nature is written in mathematical language. Now what Husserl and other authors, and our authors, here mean by this is that when we equate thought to mathematics, then we understand thought as Galileo understands nature. What is meant by nature is mathematics, is that nature is a process. It is autonomous in the sense a machine is autonomous, like it just runs on itself, just like an engine. The point of an engine is to run by itself, like the point of a machine is to execute a task, an order. You just need to program it so that it does the job. And so nature is looked at as like a machine. It is looked as a machine, and an ever-ending process, a never-ending process. If happiness means the match between mind and nature, then mind too must be autonomous. It must be a machine as well. So like nature, it can be programmed to do the tasks that are needed for it. And so it can be rearranged in the way that it produces more and more food, bigger cities, wider roads, railroads for the circulation of capital, etc. And so nature becomes a machine running for the interest and benefits of humans. And so the mind too can work like that. It must be rearranged in such a way that it seeks only its self-interests, that it seeks only results. And so the mind, thought, becomes a machine, or must be replaced by a machine. So the mind machine is the new organizer, the new manager of society and of the social order. And so by becoming a process, thought loses its critical aspect. It no longer thinks about thinking. Questions such as questions that are likely to put the process on hold, they are, disencouraged. To think about thinking, to think thinking is likely to open up, sacred grounds again where the process cannot enter. And so when the mind starts thinking about itself, that's, the gateway for metaphysics and, the regression towards mythology. And so this is why, for example, Arthur Schopenhauer is mentioned in a footnote there. So the authors refer to his famous Parerga and Paralipomena, which is the collection of many of his essays. So they quote from the second volume. They refer to a passage from his psychological remarks. This is the paragraph 356, in which he argues that arithmetic is the lowest form of intellectual activity because it does the same thing as a machine. So a machine simply repeats operations without even understanding what it is doing exactly. It lacks this self-awareness that is the bulk of critical thinking. And so a machine is something that, that doesn't, a machine is something that does something mindlessly without asking itself any question about the nature of its activity. A machine doesn't think of what it is doing. It is not its task to think about its activity. Its task is just to perform. Tasks. But it is this form of thought as a machine, that Enlightenment wants to promote. Thought as an uncritical, unself-reflexive, reflexive process. And so Adorno and Horkheimer refer to the philosopher Johann Fichte, who wanted thought to be an automaton. Fichte was hoping that by being an automaton, thought would be liberated from all kinds of pressures impeding its fulfillment and development. But this liberation was for Fichte, it meant to give control to praxis, meaning active action, and this control would be given to the I, to the subject, to the ego, if you want. For Fichte, the subject isn't a passive recipient of experience and knowledge, but a creator. He is actively creating his knowledge and therefore the world around him. And so the I, the ego, according to Fichte, realizes itself into the world through activity by shaping that world in its own image, And so Fichte was into mathematics as well, because he viewed mathematics as the best of all science because of its self-evidence, and of its certainty. And he wanted to base his system of knowledge on math. Like he believed that math is what is the best, science for ontology, the study of being or of essences. So very similar to Galileo, and therefore it is primarily through mathematics that the ego, the I, constructs its knowledge and asserts its dominance over nature through praxis. And so Adorno and Horkheimer say about Enlightenment that Enlightenment pushed aside the classical demand to think thinking. Fichte's philosophy is its radical fulfillment, because it distracted philosophers from the command to control praxis, which Fichte himself had wanted to enforce. And so as such, mathematics have rendered thought a tool to be used for practical purposes, just like a machine. And so we use thought to shape the world in the sense of we exploit nature. And so here, what happens is that we witness a reversal of mimesis. While in the magical stage, imitation was dynamic, with Enlightenment it becomes one-sided. And so the word must imitate the mind. And so the only concern of thought from now on is only the actual. In philosophy, the actual means what we can experience and perceive. And so thought wants to perceive the world in a certain way, a way in which way which reflects the mind. Just like when I shape a piece of wood into a chair or a table, I am perceiving the wood as how I want it to look like, right? When I shape the world from for my comfort or for my interests, what I actually perceive is me. It's the ego perceiving itself. So all phenomena must reflect the ego, it must reflect the self. And so there is a complete homogenization of all things, right? Like everything must look alike. So we don't care about nothing else than how things look. In short, only appearances matter. What is beyond experience, what is beyond appearances, must neither be affirmed nor must not be affirmed nor denied. It just has to disappear completely from the mind, like it's, you know, no longer of any concern. For example, enlightenment, or more precisely positivism, as the authors argue, doesn't need atheism to forget about God. Like, God is something that is beyond perception, so questions about whether God exists or doesn't exist is completely a waste of time. You know, to try to prove or disprove the existence of God is metaphysics, and who cares about such questions? The only thing that matters is how much profit I can make, how much food I can produce out of the land, how many cars I can produce in the shortest amount of time, how many views I can get, etc., etc. And so any deviance from this obsession is now the new taboo. What is considered irrational today, what is, you know, senseless, is when someone doesn't express this obsession about always more abundance, about infinite quantities of stuff, etc. So when no one demands more stuff, the process loses all reasons of existing. So wanting other things in life is taboo. Quote, for the scientific temper, any deviation of thought from the business of manipulating the actual, any stepping outside the jurisdiction of existence, is no less senseless and self-destructive than it would be for the magician to step outside the magical circle drawn from it for its incantation. And in both cases, violation of the taboo carries a heavy price for the offender. So science has therefore drawn its own magic circle, except that its circle is boundless, it is totalizing. It spreads in all directions uncontrollably, and within that circle, thought is remained asleep or hypnotized by the prohibition to adventure in what is beyond sensory experience. And so this is where Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason becomes relevant. As the authors say, the mastery of nature draws the circle in which the critique of pure reason holds thought spellbound. Now, what is the critique of pure reason? So in brief, it is a book by Kant, but it's also an attack on what Kant calls pure reason. So for Kant, reason cannot be pure in the sense of it can pretend to be able to go beyond sensory experience. Pure reason thinks of itself as capable of apprehending realities that exist beyond perception, and so perception is what is finite, limited, and so beyond it lies the infinite. But reason is also finite and limited, and therefore it cannot understand the infinite. But Kant recognizes that thought has a restless tendency to toil towards the infinite. So his doctrine is twofold. On the one hand, thought is constantly running after the infinite, but on the other, thought is finite, it is limited. And so both of these aspects are antinomic, meaning that each can build a strong case for themselves, like both positions can be valid. And so we arrive at a seemingly paradoxical conclusion. Quote, there is no being in the world that knowledge cannot penetrate, but what can be penetrated by knowledge is not being. So thought would then be trapped within a circle. On the one hand, thought would be assigning knowledge to objects a priori, and then discover that knowledge a posteriori. Like, I don't look at a tree and I see that's a table. I turn the tree into a table and I'm like, oh, would you look at that? It's a table. So Kant found that thought has trapped itself in a loop in which, you know, it discovers what it already knew. As such, there is no such thing as novelty. What is new is simply what was known a priori, like thought repeats itself over and over again. It discovers the knowledge that it had already, that was already placed, that it had already placed into the object that it is studying. And so the philosophers who put emphasis on mathematics as, you know, the first real science are simply expecting nature to give them back that knowledge. They want to see the numbers and equations in the actualization of natural objects. It is, you know, it is basically an intellectual jerk-off. You know, thought is looking at the world, but it is in reality contemplating itself. It is masturbating while looking at itself. So knowledge is just tautological. It is about saying what we already said, and keeping and keep repeating that knowledge over and over again. So the only thing that remains is a never unchanging I think, you know, like in Cartesian metaphysics, there is only an ego, there's only an I that contemplates itself in thought, and as such the I and the process of thinking must be present in every single conception. Nothing can exist in its own right, but only as something created by and for the ego. And so it's like the I is an absolute stalker, constantly, you know, judging you, obliging you to be like the I wants you to look like. And so the end result is that neither side get to be who they are. The I is the I, by putting itself as the only entity that is sovereign over the world, remains unchanged. It doesn't evolve. It doesn't seek to understand itself. And as we've pointed, if the I is a machine, well, it doesn't know itself. It cannot, you know, have that self-reflective aspect. And as for the object, it simply becomes a projection of the I. It becomes a projection of the subject that is even concealed from itself. So the subject is an entity that doesn't know itself and that tries to find itself into the rest of the objects. And so the result is that neither subject nor object is in reality known. None get to be themselves. And so the happy marriage between the mind and the nature of thing is achieved, but at what cost? You know, I mean, what was sacrificed for this union was depth. So neither mind nor things know their own depth. They are both stuck at the surface level of their being, like what is immediately at hand, what is just useful. And so the determinate negation in the Hegelian dialectic didn't, you know, negate the idea that there are only surfaces. It negated that things have a depth other than the one conferred to it by the I. And so the mind decides of the depth of thing. And this is the opposite of what negation is supposed to do according to the authors. Negation, like real negation, is supposed to negate the idea that there are only surfaces. Like we have to think that things are surfaces, not because that's only what they are, but because surfaces mean that there is something deeper going on. That, you know, things have a history, a meaning, an identity behind that surface. And so that depth is what is supposed to be grasped by knowledge. Quote, to grasp existing things as such, not merely to note their abstract spatial temporal relationships by which they can then be seized, but on the contrary, to think of them as surface, as mediated conceptual moments which are only fulfilled by revealing their social, historical, and human meaning. This whole aspiration of knowledge is abandoned. Knowledge does not consist in mere perception, classification, and calculation, but precisely in the determining negation of whatever is directly at hand. So that kind of knowledge is suspected with metaphysics, and so it must be abandoned. So the only knowledge that is legit is the one that, you know, limits itself to perception, to calculation, and to classification. And so it is a knowledge that stops at immediacy. The things that I experience in their immediacy is precisely perception. There is no medium anymore between me and how I see the world. From here, the only relevant knowledge is the one that would allow me to control or shape that perception. So I control immediacy, and arithmetic is the appropriate knowledge for that. So here again, we see that enlightenment is still mythology, right? Enlightenment precisely accuses people who believe in myth for, you know, not going beyond the surface of things, right? Things appear to me as scary because I don't understand them. The ocean, the forest are scary things. That's how, you know, they appear, at least. And because I don't want to go beyond that fear, beyond my primary experience, I start, you know, creating gods, demons, and spirits, and then, you know, a science that would allow me to control that perception. And so magic is the science of primitive people to control and shape immediate perception. But enlightenment does the same thing, but with mathematics instead of magic. So it is a regression towards mythology. Like mythology equates the social order with, you know, the cyclical essence of nature, since that's how they perceived it. They kept, you know, repeating and reenacting that social order in their stories. The myth of Persephone, for example, in Greek mythology, is about how nature got its cyclical aspect. Persephone was the daughter of the goddess Demeter, now the goddess of harvest and agriculture. So she's a fertility goddess. But Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, and Hades was the god of the he was the god of the underworld, because he thought that Persephone was hot, and so Demeter begged Hades to let Persephone go. So he accepted under one condition, that Persephone would spend 6 months with her mother, and then 6 months with him again in the underworld. And well, I mean, actually he tricked her with a pomegranate, but that's just a detail. So during spring and summer, Persephone is with Demeter, so Demeter is happy, and so that's why we have food and flowers. Then she goes back to Hades, and so Demeter is sad, because that's why you have autumn and winter. So Adorno and Horkheimer tell us that the same principle in that myth is also the same behind science. It's about, you know, a repetition of the past. The rape of Persephone wasn't a single event that happened in the past, but became a loop from which, you know, there is no escape. So rituals keep reenacting over and over that myth, and therefore everything in the actual meaning what we can experience, must be itself a repetition of that ancient event, that ancient myth. So myth for the primitives is mathematics for Galileo. It is the language of nature. It is the pattern that repeats the actual, and so nothing can escape from it if it wants to live. It is like, you know, blackmail. If you want to exist, you have to repeat the formula. So if you repeat it, then your identity as yourself is negated. The new is actually a new form of the old. You don't have any individuality of your own. Your appearance is just a vessel for a formula. Your parents' genes, your nation's anthem, the social order, the mathematical formula, God's plan, whatever. If this is true, then we have an explanation for why social injustices prevail. Everything becomes a matter of facts, by which we mean something that repeats a pattern. Like we said previously, facts are determined by their repeatability. This means that if social injustice occurs, then it must be inevitable. If it is a fact, then it must be repeating a formula. And so by those standards, injustices become inevitable. There is, you know, nothing we can do about it. We'd say that's just nature, that's just the way it is. When talking about inequalities, it's a fact that there will always be people better than others. Some people will always be richer than others, stronger, more attractive, etc. It is a fact. And so some people deserve to be saved, others don't. Some people have been decided by their genes to be superior, for example. For some, it's their fate to suffer and be killed or exploited. It's nature. There is nothing we can do about it. And so this is often used as an argument against, for example, interventionism. The state cannot intervene means that the state cannot take away your freedom, whatever that means, but also you cannot have welfare. The state's job is not to fix injustices. No one should intervene in anyone's life, period, even to help. And so anyone who tries to act humanely towards others is accused of acting against self-interest, which is, the ultimate principle of nature, the survival of the fittest. And so that is the formula that you must repeat. What the formula is asking is conformism. Everyone must conform to the formula, and everyone who doesn't is just irrational. Just like someone who is being an altruist, it is seen as irrational. And so individuality is therefore eradicated, and it is replaced by what they call pseudo-individuality, something we will eventually return to because it's an important concept. For now, let's just say that it's when your individuality, or the thing that makes you that makes your individuality, is reduced to, well, just a thing, something to be engineered like any other thing. People are giving different individualities, but they're all basically the same. It's when everyone wants to be unique, for example, everyone wants to have their own style, but they end up all looking alike. And so individuality can be understood as your soul, or your soul is a metaphor for individuality. And the authors give, I think, one of the best sentences of the book right here. They write, "Animism had endowed things with souls. Industrialism makes souls into things." So there is an asterisk there. The phrase was changed compared to 1944. In 44, they say industry instead of industrialism. Industry makes souls into things. That wouldn't be accurate, like it's not really industry itself that makes that, but rather a certain attitude towards it. So industrialism is better. And there is also a sentence that was supposed to follow, but was removed in 1947, and it is a sentence about monopolists. It says, "The rule of monopolists, as of individual capitalists earlier, is not expressed directly in the command of the rulers." It's also an idea that we will go back to a lot in the culture industry, but they removed it from the 1947 edition, probably because it is too charged with Marxist jargon, and we explain, why they wanted to keep some distance with Marxist terminology in the afterword. But the idea is that in the order of things, you don't actually see the command. The rulers are not here commanding you, giving you orders. This is also why the term industrialism is more accurate, because it suggests a whole ideology, like a whole worldview. Like industrialism makes it so that the ruler doesn't have to command in order to rule. If I have to command, it means that you have a will of your own, that there is something within you that I did not program, let's say. I am obliged to use brute force in order to make you obey me. But if I was able to shape your behavior before you were even born, if I was able to create an order, a machine in which you will be only a cog, like just as you are born, you will be immediately in your place, and you will do your job exactly like a machine. It doesn't. There is no command needed from me. And so this is what it means to turn souls into things. I can program you before you were even born. And so, as they say, on its own account, even in advance of total planning, the economic apparatus endows commodities with the values which decide the behavior of people. So the economic system will decide in advance what behavior you will adopt. And so this is the ultimate goal of enlightenment. It is to turn everything into a fetish so that you will come into a system that hides its ideological mechanisms. And when thought is deprived of its critical aspect, it cannot perceive what is below the surface, of the economic apparatus. And so it literally turns everything, every agent, into an unconscious robot. And so it has a culture of mass production and of passive consumption to keep the mind numb, so that its critical faculties can never be stimulated or awakened. And so without that, people would determine their self-worth based only on appearances, not specifically on looks, but on what can be grasped in terms of facts. Individuals value themselves in terms of success or failure, which is calculable. How much money you earn, how many trips you can make in a year, what kind of car do you drive, do you have a prestigious job, how many times you go to luxurious restaurants, do you often go to places that have a pool, you know? And so everything about yourself can be recorded in statistics. This is what it means to base your self-worth on looks. It's about, you know, self-preservation, about how good you are at adapting to your environment. We literally judge you in terms of that today. It's no coincidence that in job interviews we ask you how well you perform under pressure. It's to see if the program is working or if you are a defective piece, right? And so the best way for self-preservation is statistics, because it documents and traces your existence. It makes you manageable. We know where to put you in order to extract the most out of you. And so knowledge serves, therefore, only the purpose of making the individual something to manage. And what's best than that to make collective an accomplice in all of this, right? When you are constantly under the pressure of the gaze of others, like we said, it's not the rulers who make the command. The collective, the dominated, do the rule of the rulers. You know, the ruled rule themselves for the rulers. And it is us, the consumers, who put this pressure on others and ourselves. It's not, you know, the owners of Google that scare you when you release a video on YouTube. It's not Zuckerberg that scares you when you make a post on Facebook or Instagram. It's not Elon Musk who makes you anxious when you make a tweet. It's those who will watch your videos or read your tweets like they are the source of fear. Will they watch or not? Will they like or dislike? Will they share or not? Like, the command of the rulers is already everywhere. The process is totalitarian in that sense. It is the collective that is keeping an eye on you. So your classmates, your relatives, your co-workers, your colleagues, they're the ones doing the feedback. They're the ones documenting the statistics. And so the machine has turned every single element of the collective into a data analyzer for its own benefit, for itself, for it to run fast and smoothly. So the collective itself becomes uncritical. It doesn't see that beneath it there are other mechanisms that control it with brutality. Quote, "Yet even the threatening collective is merely a part of the deceptive surface beneath which are concealed the powers which manipulate the collective as an agent of violence." And so from the primitive times, from the times human beings feared mana, and from the times magicians and sorcerers used their knowledge to dominate and suppress others, we have enlightenment that doesn't do anything differently. Enlightenment is but a repetition of that same old story of domination. And so all it did is to spread that fear into all corners of the world. When human beings felt, themselves trapped within nature, today's humans are trapped within enlightenment with the same fear. Quote, and this is how the section ends. "The noonday panic fear in which nature suddenly appeared to humans as an all-encompassing power has found its counterpart in the panic which is ready to break out at any moment today. Human beings expect the world, which is without issue, to be set ablaze by a universal power which they themselves are and over which they are powerless." And that's it for the second section of the concept of enlightenment. Next week we will go through the third and last section of the first essay, and after that we are going to jump directly into the culture industry, and I think I will leave the two excursuses for after the culture industry, because the culture industry has actually 7 sections and I'm gonna do a video on each one. So So I think that I'm gonna go through the culture industry first once I finish the concept of enlightenment, and then I will circle back to the first excursus, which is a case study on the myth of Odysseus. So that's it, and thank you for watching. I hope these videos help you read and understand these complex texts, and as always, subscribe and all of that, and share this video if you find it helpful. And as always, thank you for watching, and I will